Two skeletons buried roughly 10,000 years and several thousand miles apart sit side by side on a lab bench in 2017. One was pulled from a cave near modern-day Beijing. The other came from a riverbank in western Russia. Neither person ever crossed paths with the other, and neither had any way of knowing what their bones would eventually reveal. When researchers sequence both genomes and lay the results next to each other, they find something that will eventually rewrite a piece of the story of how modern Chinese and modern European populations actually came to exist, and it isn't the clean, tidy split most textbooks describe. Picture two labs on opposite sides of the world, each holding a set of full human genomes ready to compare. One set comes from modern Chinese populations, the other comes from modern European populations. On paper, this should be one of the most straightforward comparisons in all of genetics, two large, well-studied groups, centuries of assumed differences, an obvious result waiting to be confirmed. Instead, when researchers actually ran the comparison in full using ancient DNA alongside modern genomes, the results overturned some of the most basic assumptions people carry about where these two populations came from and how different they actually are. Stay with me, because the real story buried inside this comparison is stranger and far more interesting than most people expect. Let's start with the number that surprises almost everyone walking into this topic. Modern Chinese and modern European populations, genetically speaking, split apart from a shared ancestral population somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's an almost absurdly short amount of time. For comparison, the ancestors of humans and chimpanzees split apart somewhere around 6 million years ago. The split between the ancestors of modern Chinese and modern European populations happened roughly 1% of that distance back, an evolutionary blink of an eye. Every visible difference in appearance that people associate with these two populations today, skin tone, eye shape, hair texture, facial structure, evolved within that comparatively tiny window layered on top of a genome that, underneath those surface differences, remains overwhelmingly similar. Here's where the story gets specific enough to actually name names and dates. In 2017, researchers sequencing the genome of a roughly 40,000-year-old individual recovered from Tianyuan Cave, near modern-day Beijing, found something that helped pin down this timeline with real precision. The Tianyuan individual's DNA consistently shared more genetic material with ancient and present-day East and Southeast Asian populations, along with Native American populations, than with either ancient or modern Europeans. Since that individual lived roughly 40,000 years ago, researchers concluded that the genetic separation between the ancestors of modern Europeans and modern East Asians had to have already happened by that point, meaning the actual split itself is at least that old, and very likely somewhat older. That same year, a separate discovery complicated the picture in a genuinely fascinating way. Researchers analyzing the genome of a man who died at least 36,000 years ago near a site called Kostenki-Borshevo in western Russia found that his DNA shared genetic sequences with contemporary Europeans, but not with East Asians, essentially the mirror image of the Tianyuan result. Put those two individuals side by side, one in China, one in Russia, both living within a few thousand years of each other, one clearly on the ancestral line toward modern East Asians, the other clearly on the ancestral line toward modern Europeans, and you get a genuinely precise window for when this split occurred, sometime in the several thousand-year gap between these two individuals' lifetimes, somewhere around 40 to 45,000 years ago. But here's the part that actually shocked researchers the most, and it came from an even earlier discovery. In Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, right in the heart of what would later become Europe, researchers recovered human remains dated to roughly 45,000 years ago, making them among the oldest modern human remains ever found on the European continent. When the genomes were sequenced, the result wasn't what anyone expected. These individuals, living in Europe, turned out to be genetically closer to the ancestors of modern East Asian populations than to the ancestors of modern Europeans. In other words, some of the very first modern humans to set foot in Europe were not, in a genetic sense, ancestors of the people who live in Europe today at all. Their lineage appears to have simply died out, or moved on without contributing meaningfully to the population that eventually became modern Europeans, while carrying ancestry more closely tied to populations that would later settle much further east. This overturned a long-standing, tidy assumption that early humans leaving Africa split cleanly into an eastward-moving group and a westward-moving group almost immediately, with each group settling down and becoming the ancestors of modern Asians and modern Europeans, respectively. The Bacho Kiro find shows the real picture was messier and more interesting than that. Early modern human populations moved, mixed, and in some cases vanished entirely, well before the ancestral lines that led to today's populations actually stabilized. Modern Europeans and modern Chinese populations aren't simply the tidy end result of one clean fork in the Road 45. 1,000 years ago, they're the surviving branches of a much more tangled, exploratory period of early human expansion across Eurasia, one where plenty of other branches, genetically distinct from both modern groups, existed and ultimately dead-ended. So if the split happened this recently and this messily, what does the actual genetic distance between modern Chinese and modern European populations look like today? Population geneticists measure this using a statistic called FEFEST, which quantifies how much of a population's genetic variation is explained by group membership versus individual variation within the group. Studies comparing Han Chinese and European populations typically find an FEST value in the range of about 11%, meaning roughly 11% of measured genetic variation tracks with this particular population split. That might sound like a meaningful number until you remember the flip side of that statistic. It means around 89% of the underlying genetic variation has nothing to do with whether someone is Chinese or European at all. It reflects the ordinary variation that exists between any two individuals, full stop, group membership aside. The headline number that actually separates these two populations is a small slice of the total genetic picture, not the dominant story the genome is telling. To put that in more concrete terms, imagine lining up 10,000 genetic markers scattered across the genome and checking how each one varies between a random person from Beijing and a random person from Berlin. The overwhelming majority of those markers would show variation that has nothing to do with which city either person is from. The same kind of variation you'd find comparing two random people from Beijing alone or two random people from Berlin alone. Only a relatively small subset of markers disproportionately concentrated in genes tied to highly visible traits like skin, pigmentation, eye shape, and a handful of other adaptive features actually track cleanly with population origin. Genetically, in other words, a random Chinese person and a random European person share the vast majority of their variation with each other. And it's a comparatively narrow set of visible, adaptive traits doing almost all of the work in making the two groups look as distinct as they do to the eye. Skin pigmentation is the trait most responsible for how different these two populations look to the eye. And it's worth explaining exactly why, because the biology here is more specific than most people realize. Populations that settled in regions with intense, direct, year-round ultraviolet exposure evolved darker skin, largely to protect against UV damage and to preserve folate, a nutrient the body needs for healthy reproduction and cell division, which UV radiation breaks down at high exposure levels. Populations that settled at higher latitudes with weaker, more seasonal sunlight evolved lighter skin over time because lighter skin allows the body to synthesize more vitamin D in conditions where UV exposure is limited for much of the year. European and East Asian populations both evolved lighter skin compared to their shared ancestors, but through genuinely different genetic roots. Researchers have found that lighter skin in East Asian populations and lighter skin in European populations are controlled by substantially different sets of genetic variants, meaning these two populations arrived at visually similar outcomes, lighter skin than their tropical ancestors, through largely separate evolutionary paths, a textbook case of what biologists call convergent evolution. The two lineages faced a broadly similar environmental problem after leaving the tropics and independently found their own genetic solutions to it. Eye shape tells an even more specific and localized story. The almond-shaped eye structure, common across East Asian populations, traces back to a specific genetic variant in the EDAR gene, believed to have arisen in ancient populations in China roughly 30,000 years ago, an adaptation researchers connect to protection against the extreme cold, wind, and glare of the Ice Age Central Asian steppe. European populations never developed this same variant, largely because the specific environmental pressure that favored it, the particular combination of intense reflected light and extreme cold on open, treeless terrain, wasn't a defining feature of the environments most early European populations settled in. It's a clean example of how a specific ancient environment shaped a specific traceable genetic outcome in one lineage without producing the same outcome in a lineage living under different regional conditions just a few thousand miles away. Hair texture follows a similar logic. The same EDAR gene variant linked to eye shape and skin traits is also strongly associated with the thick, straight hair texture common across East Asian populations, while European hair texture, more commonly wavy or curly, developed through an entirely separate set of genetic variants that never spread through East Asian populations at all. Neither trait is better or more advanced than the other in any biological sense. They're simply two different genetic solutions layered onto two populations that diverged from a common ancestor 40-some thousand years ago and then spent tens of thousands of years adapting to different regional conditions largely independently of one another. Nose shape offers another clear example of climate leaving its fingerprint directly on the skeleton. A 2017 study published in PLOS Genetics, led by geneticist Arslan Zaidi, analyzed nasal passage measurements across populations of European and East Asian ancestry and found that colder, drier climates favor narrower nasal passages, which help humidify and warm air before it reaches the lungs, reducing the risk of respiratory damage in harsh winter conditions. Populations with ancestry from colder regions of Europe tend to show narrower nasal openings on average compared to populations whose ancestors adapted to different regional climates, a subtle but measurable skeletal difference that researchers were able to link directly to specific genes under active natural selection, not to any general racial category, but to the specific climate a given population's ancestors spent thousands of years adapting to. Body proportion follows a related climate logic described by a principle biologists call Bergmann's and Allen's rules, originally developed studying animals but consistently observed in human populations too. Populations adapted to colder climates tend, on average, to have relatively shorter limbs and bulkier torsos, a body shape that conserves heat by reducing surface area relative to body mass. Populations adapted to hotter climates tend toward longer limbs and leaner builds, which helps the body shed excess heat more efficiently. These are population-level averages shaped by thousands of years of climate adaptation, not a rule that predicts anything about any specific individual, but the broad pattern shows up consistently enough across skeletal studies of ancient and modern populations worldwide that researchers treat it as one of the more reliable climate-linked adaptive signals in human anatomy, sitting right alongside nose shape and skin pigmentation as traits shaped primarily by climate rather than by any deeper ancestral divide between these two populations. Blood type frequency adds another layer to the comparison, and it's one that rarely comes up in these conversations, even though the data has been available for decades. The ABO blood group system shows real measurable frequency differences between European and Chinese populations. Type O blood is the most common type across most European populations, while type B blood occurs at meaningfully higher frequency across many Chinese and broader East Asian populations compared to Europe. These differences trace back to ancient population history and, in some cases, to selective pressure from historical disease environments, since certain blood types offer measurably different levels of resistance to specific pathogens like cholera and certain strains of malaria. It's a genuinely real, traceable genetic difference between the two populations, and yet it has nothing to do with the traits people usually associate with population comparisons and everything to do with quiet, centuries-long interactions between local disease environments and the immune system. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood, tells one of the more dramatic divergent stories between these two populations. The genetic mutation that allows most adult Europeans to digest dairy without discomfort arose fairly recently, likely somewhere in Central Europe within the last 7,000 to 10,000 years, spreading rapidly alongside the rise of cattle herding and dairy farming in the region. That specific mutation never developed or never spread to any meaningful degree in East Asian populations where dairy farming historically played a far smaller role in traditional diets. As a result, lactase persistence rates in adult European populations run dramatically higher, often cited above 90% in some northern European countries, compared to East Asian populations where the ability to comfortably digest dairy into adulthood is far less common, frequently cited in a range closer to 10 to 20%. Depending on the specific population studied. It's one of the starkest, most measurable physiological differences between the two populations, and it's driven almost entirely by a single, relatively recent genetic mutation tied directly to a specific agricultural lifestyle, not by any deeper ancient divergence between the two groups. Here's where the comparison takes an unexpected turn that most people watching a video like this one don't see coming. Both modern Chinese and modern European populations carry Neanderthal DNA, and the amounts are far closer than most people assume. Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia, and interbred with the modern human populations moving through those regions after leaving Africa. Because of this, most non-African populations today, including both Europeans and East Asians, carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. Studies have actually found that East Asian populations carry a slightly higher average percentage of Neanderthal DNA than European populations, a modest but real and consistently replicated difference likely tied to specific patterns of ancient population mixing and dilution that happened differently in the two regions over the following tens of thousands of years. It's a genuinely counterintuitive result given that Neanderthals lived in Europe and never set foot in East Asia, yet the population that ended up carrying slightly more of their DNA over time was the one whose ancestors moved furthest away from where Neanderthals actually lived. The likely explanation comes down to dilution rather than any additional interbreeding event. Researchers believe the ancestors of modern Europeans continued to receive substantial genetic input from populations with less Neanderthal ancestry after the initial interbreeding event, including migrations of early farmers from the Near East and later steppe pastoralist populations moving into Europe during the Bronze Age. each wave slightly diluting the original Neanderthal genetic contribution. The ancestors of East Asian populations, by contrast, appear to have experienced somewhat less of this kind of diluting gene flow after their own initial mixing with Neanderthals, allowing a slightly higher proportion of that ancient ancestry to persist undiluted through to today. It's a reminder that the amount of archaic ancestry a population carries today isn't simply a record of how much interbreeding happened in the deep past. It's also a record of everything that happened to that population's gene pool in the tens of thousands of years since. Denisovan ancestry tells an even starker story of geographic surprise. Denisovans, a separate group of archaic humans identified from DNA recovered in a Siberian cave, contributed measurable ancestry to modern populations, but overwhelmingly to populations in South and East Asia, Melanesia, and the Pacific. Essentially, none of it showing up in European populations at all. Mainland East Asian populations carry a small but measurable amount of Denisovan ancestry, while European populations carry essentially none. This makes sense once you consider the geography involved. The ancestors of modern Europeans moved west into a landscape where Neanderthals were the dominant archaic population, while the ancestors of modern East Asians moved east and south along routes that appear to have crossed paths with Denisovan populations at some point, likely somewhere in Asia, in an encounter that simply never happened along the western migration route into Europe. This is one of the clearest, cleanest genetic differences that actually does separate these two populations in a meaningful, traceable way. Not skin color, not eye shape, but a specific archaic ancestry contribution tied to exactly which ancient human relatives a population's ancestors happen to encounter and interbreed with on their way to their eventual homeland. There is also a more recent chapter to this comparison that gets overlooked constantly because it doesn't fit the assumption that European and Chinese populations developed in near total isolation from one another until relatively modern times. Genetic studies analyzing gene flow between European and East Asian populations have found measurable, datable admixture events, real evidence of ancestors from one population mixing directly with the other, occurring as recently as roughly 2,400 to 300 years ago in many of the populations studied. That window lines up strikingly well with some of the biggest chapters in Eurasian history. The era of the Silk Road, which formally opened as a trade network in the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Empire's extensive eastward trade, contacts, and later the Mongol Empire, which briefly connected the eastern and western ends of the continent under a single political system. Researchers even found a clear geographic pattern to this mixing, a gradual decline in European-related ancestry, moving from Central Asia toward East Asia, essentially a genetic echo of the actual trade and migration routes that connected these two ends of the Eurasian landmass for centuries. The highest levels of this mixed ancestry consistently show up in populations sitting right along the historical Silk Road corridor itself, in places like Xinjiang in western China, where modern populations carry a genuinely blended genetic profile drawing on both Western Eurasian and East Asian ancestral sources, in proportions that shift depending on exactly where along that ancient trade route a given community's ancestors settled. This lines up precisely with what history already tells us happened there. Merchants, monks, soldiers, and entire families moving back and forth along that corridor for well over 1,000 years, trading goods, religions, and inevitably genes, long before anyone had a word for genetics at all. The DNA data doesn't just confirm that this kind of contact happened, it lets researchers put an actual date range and a geographic gradient on exactly how it unfolded. Put all of this together, and the picture that emerges is genuinely different from what most people expect walking into a video with this title. Modern Chinese and modern European populations are not too ancient, separately evolved branches of humanity that only recently made contact. They're two populations that split from a shared ancestor within the last 50,000 years, spent tens of thousands of years developing distinct, regionally adaptive traits, largely independently, picked up different amounts and types of archaic human ancestry along the way depending on exactly which extinct human relatives happened to live in their path, and then for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years at least, kept exchanging genes back and forth across the length of the continent through trade routes, empires, and migration far more consistently than most people assume. The shocking result here isn't that the two populations turned out to be secretly identical or secretly unrelated. It's that the actual data tells a story of shared recent origin, largely independent adaptation, and ongoing, quietly persistent contact. A far more interconnected and dynamic history than the simple static picture of two separate peoples that most of us grew up assuming. One more trait worth mentioning, because it's one of the most specific, well-documented genetic differences between these two populations, involves how the body processes alcohol, a variant of the ALDH2 gene, which affects how efficiently the body breaks down a toxic byproduct of alcohol metabolism, is carried by a substantial percentage of people with East Asian ancestry, roughly a third to a half depending on the specific population, and is almost entirely absent in European populations. People carrying this variant experience a rapid buildup of that toxic byproduct after drinking, producing the flushed skin, elevated heart rate, and nausea, commonly known as alcohol flush reaction. Researchers estimate this specific variant arose somewhere in China several thousand years ago and spread through selection pressure that remains somewhat debated, though some researchers have connected it to reduced susceptibility to certain parasitic infections in individuals carrying the variant. It's a clean example of a genuinely significant, well-documented, and medically relevant genetic difference between these two populations, tracing back to one specific, identifiable mutation, rather than any broad, sweeping difference in overall biology between the two groups. It's worth being precise about what this comparison does not show, because pseudoscientific claims comparing populations have unfortunately circulated for well over a century, long before modern genomics existed to actually test them. This kind of population comparison shows real, measurable, traceable genetic differences tied to specific traits and specific ancient migration and adaptation histories. It does not show, and modern genomics has never found any credible evidence for, any genetic basis for ranking either population as more intelligent, more capable, or biologically superior to the other in any general sense. Traits like intelligence emerge from an enormous number of genes interacting with environment, upbringing, nutrition, and culture in ways that make simple population-level rankings scientifically indefensible, and serious population geneticists across the field have said so explicitly and repeatedly. What the data actually supports is real traceable ancestry and adaptation. It has never supported, and does not support now, a hierarchy built on top of that ancestry. Consumer DNA testing companies rely on exactly this kind of research to generate the ancestry percentages people see in their own results today. When a test reports a high percentage of European or East Asian ancestry, it's drawing on decades of population genetics research, including the ancient genomes from Tianyuan, Kostenki, and Bachokiro, discussed in this video, research that has mapped with increasing precision exactly how these two enormous population groups formed, diverged, adapted, and at various points across history, quietly reconnected. The pie chart on a phone screen is the modern, simplified surface of a genuinely deep, well-documented, and still actively researched scientific story. So the next time someone assumes Chinese and European populations represent two ancient, fundamentally separate branches of humanity, you'll know the more accurate version of the story. A shared ancestral population left Africa together, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago, in a process messier and less linear than textbooks used to suggest. That population split into the lineages that would eventually become modern Europeans and modern East Asians. Both lineages adapted to their new environments in their own ways, sometimes converging on similar-looking traits through completely different genetic paths, sometimes picking up entirely different pieces of ancient extinct human ancestry along the way. And for thousands of years since, they never fully stopped exchanging genes, trading not just goods and ideas across the Silk Road and beyond, but people and DNA in both directions. Go back to those two skeletons on the lab bench, the one from Beijing and the one from Western Russia, separated by thousands of miles and, as it turns out, only a few thousand years of drifting apart from the same ancestral population. Neither one of them could have imagined the populations their descendants would eventually become, the empires, languages, and cultures that would rise on opposite ends of a continent they never lived to see connected. And yet the DNA sitting quietly in both of their bones already contained the entire outline of that story, waiting tens of thousands of years for the technology to finally read it. If this changed the way you think about how closely or distantly these two populations are actually related, like this video and subscribe, because we cover the real genetic story behind population history every single week, not the assumptions most of us grew up with. Drop a comment with which two populations you want us to compare next, and if you know someone who still pictures European and Chinese ancestry as two ancient, unrelated stories, send this their way. The real data tells a far more connected story than either textbook version most people were taught.